Hey everyone, my name is David Rao and I am the music teacher who blogs at makemomentsmatter.org, and I share things on Pinterest and on my podcast, which is Make Moments Matter, a music education podcast, and I share ideas sort of all over. I thought I would share today a little bit about how I teach the instrument families. I had someone email me today and ask, well, I bought this instrument bundle from you. How do you teach these? Like what order? What do you do? So I thought I'd share just a little bit about how I do it. So the instrument families, I think, it's sort of a hard idea to think about how to teach it, but really there are a lot of things that you can do, and some are sort of more formal and some are sort of not. I would start early with more informal sort of things. And so the first thing I would do, I put posters in my hallway. I have an instrument alphabet set that I've made with different instrument pictures of real pictures of the instruments of each instrument, or an instrument for each letter. And so that really early on, I used to have it above my whiteboard. It doesn't fit in my room anymore, so I put it out in the hallway. And kids can walk by and say like, hey, accordion or whatever. And then I have a lot of instruments that are instruments of the orchestra mixed in, but it gives kids exposure. That sort of starts early to get them excited about it. Let me show you, I'm in my music room. Let me show you something else that I do. Hope it's not too shaky. I have these instrument flags that I made. And I have a set of flags for each of the instrument families. And I have these displayed all the time. I use these, I reference these a lot. If we ever are listening to music, I might go point to them. But I've got these out, and I don't think I have printed all of the instruments from each family that I actually have flags for, but I have quite a few of them printed. Here, see if I can back up. Please don't make fun of my messy room. But I have a lot of them out, and I have them out because I that exposure and to sort of see those early on, but also because in my classes, I take every class that I have and I sort of chop them up into 4 teams. So then later on, if I'm doing a game or something where I need those teams, I have them preset. So at the beginning of the year, that's one of the beginning things that we do is like teamwork and figuring out what team am I on for all year. But I don't call them teams, I call them families. So each team is either called the strings family, the woodwinds family, the brass family, the percussion family. And I refer to that all the time. In fact, when we line up every day, I say, oh great, strings family can line up first. Oh, here, I sat down, I should show you this too. But I have on my ceiling, I have colorful tape. And guess what? These colors match the instrument flags. And guess what? Those also match these little things I made, which is Family of the Week. And so that changes every week. Kids are interfacing with this information all the time because they know, oh, my family might get to do this first or whatever. And so they get that experience all over all the time. And they start associating their color, red as brass and green as percussion. They start associating that very, very early on. And then they just hear those words, the families, all the time. They hear strings, they hear percussion, they hear that, and then they can look at their families and see what's there. In fact, I use bulletin boards a lot. I have a bulletin board thing that I do every year at the beginning of the year. I have these posters that are like super, super old. You probably have these or have seen these in catalogs. And these are just the instrument families, these huge, huge posters printed on this cardboard. I mean, I cannot tell you when these photos were taken. I remember these were up in my music room when I was a little kid growing up. And these colors match the tape on the ceiling and they match the flags. And I did that on purpose because I want them, again, to have the color coordination helps. But at the beginning of the year, I put some of those photos out in the hallway. And I have a bulletin board that says, like, can you help me find my family? And I sort of mix them up, and then kids can associate the colors or put them together, and that's super fun. Another thing I've done with bulletin boards, I'll post, I have a set in my Teachers Pay Teacher store that's something called like Read All About Me. And you know, kids, every class, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they get to do a poster where they talk about themselves. What's my favorite color? What's my favorite whatever? Well, I took that idea and I did that with the instruments. So there are about 10 or so, and I put all those out. It's like one's the flute and one's the trumpet, and they say like, what's my favorite thing to do? To play super high and quiet, or I get to be the bird in Peter and the Wolf. You know, it tells fun little facts. And so each week what I've done, sometimes I'll do like a family of the week. So then I'll put up like all of the brass big posters along with those Read All About Me posters. It's a way to incorporate resources I have at my school and stuff I've made for my Teachers Pay Teachers store, but it gives kids, again, that great exposure. So I do the family of the week, sometimes bulletin board. I do that can you help me find my family? The flags help, the instrument alphabet helps. That's all just general exposure stuff. I'd say another thing that you can do that's great just for teaching exposure is early on to involve content that involves the instrument families. So Peter and the Wolf, that's a great thing. It gives them exposure to hearing and maybe seeing, if you have a book, some of those instruments. Carnival of the Animals is another one that's fun to play with, it's fun to do stuff with, and again, gets kids interested in the families and orchestral instruments. A little bit later on, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, I have the Remarkable Farkle McBride in my sub-tub kit. I actually got a great kit from Shelley Tomich on Teachers Pay Teachers, and it's all activities that go with Remarkable Farkle, and that just sits in my sub-tub and is so great to have. I also have The Composer is Dead. I have that in my sub-tub, and again, these are things that, like, you know, maybe at the end of the year, if I haven't been gone enough, I'll pull them out and do those with students. But it's nice to have something musical that does interface with the content that you can have early on, just sitting in your sub-tub. So books are great. Those early on exposure things, just to get kids excited. I think that's where I would start. And then when I'm actually trying to teach the families, I would start either 3rd or 4th or 5th grade. It depends on what your goal is. And it depends on, you know, where that fits in your district curriculum. Not everybody has a curriculum that includes the instrument families. I get that. At my old district, we had like exposure to instrument families, but not necessarily at a certain grade. I used to teach them in 3rd grade. In this district, we are assessed on instrument families in 5th grade. So that's when we do it. We do instrument families in 5th grade. There's a pre-test and a post-test, so we teach it in the middle. But they get that exposure all throughout their experience, K-5. But, I mean, it really depends on what you want to do. Honestly, I do not teach for timbre. I don't teach for them to hear an instrument and to be able to identify it. For a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't think it's that important in elementary. I mean, I want them to be able to distinguish between like a brass sound and a woodwind sound, but if they can't differentiate between clarinet and oboe, I don't really care. I mean, like, it'd be nice for them to know, but what's the point? You know, like yes, it's important, but there are so many things that they could learn. I feel like that's splitting hairs. Let them deal with that later on, if at all. There are so many other musical things that we could get to that I'm not going to pound that into them. But I know a lot of people like teaching timbre. It's up to you. What I try and teach, and I didn't do this when I first started teaching this, but I've come across this, is now I try and teach so that if a student sees an instrument, that they can identify and categorize into one of the 4 families. Because students see instruments all the time, and I want them, if nothing else, to be able to be like, that's a brass instrument. And so I break it down, and what I do is I created this set, and I'll show you on Teachers Pay Teachers. You can use my process and not the resource. I'm not saying you have to use the resource, but I just want to show you what I use and why, because it goes through how I do it. I teach them in order. I teach like 1 instrument family per lesson or maybe per week when I'm teaching instrument families, and I teach it in this order. I teach brass family first, woodwinds family next, strings family, and then percussion family last. So let me show you the resource I use because it explains it a little bit better. And I'm going to try and turn my phone around this time so that you're going backwards. It's working. Let's see if my computer keeps working. So what do? So I teach, I have these PowerPoints, and I start with identification. And I go through the PowerPoint, and well, basically what it does is the kids get to see the instrument, and it gives them clues as to figure out how do you categorize the instrument. So I start with brass, and I say, first of all, it has to have a mouthpiece. It's a wind instrument, which means your breath goes in, so it has to have a mouthpiece. That's the place where you put your mouth. It's the mouthpiece. So kids get that. That's super easy. I tell them a little bit about the mouthpiece. Usually a brass mouthpiece, well, always a brass mouthpiece has sort of a circular end because your lips buzz inside. Okay, we talk about the mouthpiece. Then we say that the brass instruments have tubing. They have all of these tubes. They're usually wound around a couple times. Some are a little bit more tubing than others, but that's a characteristic that you can look for when you're looking at an instrument, is the tubing. Then I say it has a flared bell. And this is like a precursor to talking about woodwinds, but I say it has a flared bell because air goes in the mouthpiece and the only place that air can come out is out of the bell. And so I am very intentional about showing them that, because then when you talk about woodwinds, you can be like, there are like 80 holes where air can come out. Clearly it's not brass. So this is an indicator. The flared bell is the only place air can come out. And I show them some bells point out and some go back and some go up. That doesn't matter. It just has a flared bell. We talk about that. And then I say they're made of metal, and that's a historical thing, and the metal can be gold looking or it can be silver looking, but it's actually just coated brass, and brass is a metal. That's why we call them the brass family. And I say that there are some instruments that are brass family that traditionally were metal but aren't anymore, or made from fiberglass or plastic or whatever. And I say usually if it's made out of fiberglass, it's that way because it's for a student or it's for marching band. But if you have a nicer instrument, it's going to be made out of metal. There's a reason that you have fiberglass, and I say, and that's not usually as likely. You hardly ever see that. And then I say it has valves. It only has 3 or 4 or maybe 5 places for your fingers to go. And again, this is something that I can contrast later with woodwinds, where I can say, like, it's got 40 keys or whatever. But brass is easy, it has 3 or 4. And then, of course, I have to talk about the exception, which is the trombone that has a slide. And then it's nice because then you can talk about length of tubing and how that's different. And then I say some trombones do have valves, and we talk about that too. And then I go over it, and I go through those clues again. It has to have a mouthpiece if it's going to be brass family. So then I can show them a drum or whatever, and I'm like, no mouthpiece. Well, clearly it's not brass. And then coiled tubing and flared bell made of metal and valves. And then in this PowerPoint, I actually go through, and I have them go through clue by clue. So does it have a mouthpiece? Yes. And I'm going super fast, but with students I would slow it down. Do you see coiled tubing? Sure. There are a couple bends and turns. Do you see a flared bell? Yes, because there are not other little holes all around. Is it made out of metal? Yes, it is. Does it have valves? Sure, there they are. And so then that's easy for them to sort of see, right? So then again, I go slower and I talk through it. Then I show them this, and I say, okay, well, does it have a mouthpiece? Well, it's not rounded, but yes, it does have a mouthpiece. It's where your mouth goes. Do you see coiled tubings? Well, yes, it does sort of coil and turn, sort of. Does it have a flared bell? Yes, but there are all of these other holes and places where air can escape. Is it made out of metal? Yes, it's made out of metal. That doesn't mean that it's brass. That's not the only indicator. Does it have 3 or 4 valves? No. It has a ton of little openings covered by pads. And then they have to decide brass or not. And we talk like, well, it has a couple characteristics like the mouthpiece and the bell, but there's a lot of indicators that say that it's not, and then we decide it's not brass. So that's brass family. Let me show you the contrasting woodwinds, because I teach brass in the first week, and then I teach woodwinds. And I go to woodwinds next because it's a wind instrument. So I get the wind instruments out of the way first. We talk about mouthpiece, and then if we've already done brass, I can compare and contrast and say, this mouthpiece, usually it sits in your mouth or you blow over it, but you don't buzz your lips the same way you would with brass. I'm sorry, again, I'm rushing. Sorry about this. We talk about reeds, and reeds are either double or single reed, and we talk about how that's what vibrates when you make sound. I like to go through and talk about vibration and how that's so important to making a sound. That's a science of sound thing, but we talk about that, and we talk about the single and the double reeds and how they vibrate, and sometimes I even pull out a piece of paper and show them how it can wiggle back and forth if I blow over it. And then I talk about the ones that don't have reeds and how they're different, because the reed is a clue, but it's not the only clue. And then we talk about the shape. Before we talked about tubing. So here I talk about there are some turns and twists, but usually it's straight. It's more straight than not. We talk about keys and holes, and again, this is great if you can contrast it with brass that has only 3 or 4. And again, these, I think it's nice when you can contrast with brass, because brass is so clear-cut. Round mouthpiece, 3 or 4 tubes. And so this is nice that you can compare and say, like, well, it's pointy mouthpiece or not, or reed or not, or whatever, many keys or not. But again, brass is sort of easy to compare against because it's more standardized, I sort of feel. So the keys and holes, you can talk about that, and then made out of many different materials, wood, metal, whatever it is that it was made out, what resin or what, depending on the brand or whatever, or different colored metals or mixes, and it sort of depends again on the instrument and type. And then you go through and check, and this is fun too because then they can use their clues. Does it have a mouthpiece? Sure. Does it have a reed? Yeah, if we magnify it, it's hard to tell in that picture. The shape, it's more of just a straight shape. Does it have keys and holes? Yes, a ton of them. Is it made out of many materials or a couple different materials? Well, there is metal in the instrument, but that's not all it's made of. It's made out of metal or resin or all sorts of things, and you decide woodwind or not. That's pretty easy. And then I compare it against this, and again, it's pretty easy to compare because it's easy to just sort of see the differences. But I like going through and doing that because it's a little bit more methodical and kids are actually seeing the differences. I do that, again, I only do one family per week because I don't want to overload them and I really want them to get good exposure on each one. So I do brass family, then I do woodwinds to contrast. Then I feel like the next easiest thing is strings because it's so easy to identify a stringed instrument. And finally I do percussion because percussion is like a catch-all that has just so many different kinds of instruments that it's nice to say, like, it's not brass, it's not woodwinds, it's not strings, probably it's percussion, let's look at some of those identifiers. So that's sort of fun to do. And then as sort of another thing to do, I have this set of PowerPoints, and one for each family, which is meet the instruments. And I go through and I show kids some of the most common instruments. And this is fun because a lot of times they've seen these, so it talks in each slide, it talks a little bit about each one, it talks about how you play it a little bit, it talks about where they might be commonly played, and it goes through and it gives identifiers, which it's just nice to give them the chance to see all of these things. And if you want, each slide has links to videos. And so if you click on that, it'll hyperlink you out to YouTube and it'll take you to show you some of the videos. So let me show you just a couple of videos, and I hope my internet's working. It was not working all day. Here's one of them, and it's just so fun to see the instruments in action. So this is probably a song that they'll know. And it's just, I think it's so cool that the timpanist is featured, and it's great for us because then you can go through the whole song and it shows what he's doing. I feel like it's actually pretty easy to hear once you're looking at him and seeing. So this is from percussion, and one of these from the strings family. I have, and let me go back here and just show you really quick. I usually have like a meet the timpani and then a featured video, or like a standard meet whatever, and then a video that contrasts it. So sometimes I found some like how it's made videos or whatever, and then a more interesting video. This is one of my more interesting videos to show kids how instruments can be used differently. This is Lindsay Sterling. If you've never seen her videos, they're super, super cool. She's a really interesting artist, more of like a pop fiddle violin player. And she has an electric violin, which is so cool to show kids. Actually, this video I love too because it goes through in sort of a science of sound way, and it shows this guy playing a guitar, he's the villain, and Lindsay Jervis, hey, Lindsay Sterling is the heroine, and she pulls out her instrument and plays, and they sort of fight back and forth. And one of the cool things is it does, if I can find it, is it shows sound waves. Oh, if I can find it. We'll see later on. I know it does it. There, you can sort of see it's sending waves out, and it's cool for kids to see the sound waves actually going. So I love showing videos like this, a more traditional like, what is this instrument? And then a more specialized, more interesting video after that. So I go through, let me flip this back, something else on the computer, but let me flip this around for a second. So I go through and I do brass family, woodwind, strings, and percussion, and I do it in that order. I sort of told you why. And then if I want, I can do some follow-up activities. So in this kit with the spotlight stuff, I have some worksheets where you can show them an instrument and they have to check off which one they think it is, and at the end it'll give them an answer key. And so they can say like, well, I'm going to use my clues and I'm going to try and figure out. And I show them just a variety of instruments, some that are common like piccolo or bassoon, and some that are not, like the sitar, or some other instruments that are just a little bit out there that maybe they haven't seen, but I know they can categorize if they use their clues. So I do that first. And I go through those 4 things. I have those follow-up worksheets if I want or not if I don't. Another thing I've done, and I put this in my subtub, is I have another set here. I'll see if I can show you just a little bit. And this is called Spotlight on the Instruments. This is my Teachers Pay Teachers store, but I'll just show you again. You can use the idea, but I'll just show you the resource I've made. I have these Venn diagrams so where kids can go through and they can compare and contrast. And I have some information sheets in there too that sort of give them hints, or that you can use the read all about me posters to do this. But it lets them sort of categorize what is only trumpet, what is only saxophone, what do they share. Well, they can share that they're made out of metal, or that they have places for your fingers to go, or they both have mouthpieces. But a trumpet has fewer valves, or the trumpet has tubing and a saxophone does not, or saxophone has a reed and a trumpet does not. This is a great follow-up if you've done those like class by class, sort of seen the instruments, to sort of show them, different ways to look. Or sort of how to compare. And then another thing that goes along with that is then you can have them do just a little written worksheet. And again, this is great for a subtub, but if you give them the Venn diagram first for them to sort of map out their ideas, then they should be able to write 3 or 4 sentences that give you a little bit more information about it. And then this is another fun sort of little worksheet that's like spotlight on your favorite instrument, and you can draw it and talk about it. Or if you want to assign instruments, you can do that and have them write about it. But again, this is another great sub-tub thing to have available, to have kids sort of go back and think about and talk about. If you leave some of those informational sheets, it's a really great way to go through it. Maybe you've gotten this far and you're like, but David, I think teaching timbre is important. Okay, so you want to teach more than just identification? Got it. I would say that there are a couple things that you can do. Instrument bingo is like a great way to do that. Kids love it, it's fun, it's low stress on you, and they are listening to sounds of the instruments, and they're actually getting that exposure. So there are a ton of sets on Teachers Pay Teachers, but also there's like a really super standard set that you can buy from West Music or whatever if you want. You can usually find it on the Facebook like Music Teacher Buy Sell Trade groups. And you can find it there a lot, or ask for it. And it's just, you get a little CD and it comes along and it gives you sounds, and kids write down what they think it is. That's another great resource. So instrument bingo, it sounds like, oh, it's an easy lesson. Yeah, but it works really well. So don't toss that out just because it's an easy lesson and you put on a CD and kids do their thing. I mean, kids learn by playing. It's a thing. The other thing I would want to show you, and again, I'm sorry, I have to flip this around one more time, but at least everything's not backwards like it was in the last video. I found this website. It's the Philharmonia Orchestra, and you can get sound samples. So if you just, on their YouTube page, you can see some videos too, but if you just want examples, you can go through and choose, you can choose cowbells examples, or Wero, or anything. There's so many things on here, even things that maybe you're like, wow, they're never going to have that. Well, they might. And you can go through and you can get these sound samples. They're free to listen to. You can actually download them, I think. Yeah, and I don't know why you would need like 800 clarinet examples, but here they are. You can do quiet, you can do loud, you can do medium, you can do long or short, and there are 17 pages of clarinet sounds. So that's sort of cool to be able to do that, and this is a free resource. So this is philharmonia.co.uk, it's a great resource. If you look for Philharmonia Orchestra on YouTube, the last time, I swear. If you look for them on YouTube, they have a lot of times where their principal player comes out and actually shows you how instruments are played and gives examples, and that's really, really cool. I have a lot of those videos linked on the Instrument Families bundle that I have. A couple more resources I would suggest. If you are a Teachers Pay Teachers person, I'll put links to my stuff in the comments, but if you check out Tracy King, the bulletin board lady, she just did a big blog post on workstations and how you can teach instruments of the orchestra through workstations. There are so many cool ideas there. So go check out her blog. I think her blog is mrskingrocks.com.blogspot. I don't know. You can search her. So that's a great blog post, and she has some really cool resources. Jenna Hudson on Teachers Pay Teachers has these cool flip books that are really fun to try out. She also has a little cootie catcher for like $1 or something that kids love to make. I know some schools are like, we have banned those cootie catchers, but these are curricular, so they're fun. Check that out. And then Amy Abbott has a super, super great Go Fish game. And again, don't count out games just because they're games. Kids get to see all the instruments and try them out. And so there's some super, super cool things there that kids can just sort of play around with. Okay, I've talked a lot. I'm sorry I've talked so long. If you have any other questions or ideas or thoughts about instruments of the orchestra you want to throw out there, write a comment. I will respond. Once this video is done being live, I'll post it on my page and you can go back and look through. And if you have questions or if you're like, hey, I don't know that thing you talked about, I don't know what you're talking about, or what was that link, just leave a comment and I'll put all those links in there. Let me just check. I think that's everything that I meant to talk about. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming and checking out this video. And like I said, any questions, shoot me a comment or find me on Twitter or whatever. Have a great weekend. Thanks for watching.